Thank you very much indeed, Muna. I'm very struck by these three really interesting presentations from different parts of the world, the sort of common approach and the common framework that's used to massively different impacts of the crisis and responses, but basically depending upon initial conditions and vulnerabilities, on institutional structures and on integration into financial markets. You know, it's encouraging. We know so much, actually. The question is, are we learning from it, and are we going to change anything as a result of it? Let me introduce now Andres Neumeier, who's a professor of economics at the Universidad Torcuato de Tierra in Argentina. He's a graduate, a PhD at Columbia University. He represents the International Economics Association on the GDN board. He's taught in many places, University of Southern California, the University of Chicago, New York University. He's published widely, including in the American Economic Review and Econometrica. He's the current chair of the Latin American chapter of the Econometric Society. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you for the nice introduction, and I also want to thank GDN for allowing me for inviting me to present here and talk about the regional responses to the crisis in Latin America. It's always a pleasure to be here in these GDN conferences. So I'll try to be brief. So Latin America has like this history of blowing up whatever happens in the world and having crises that are very deep and very persistent. And this time, when we're hearing about what was happening in emerging Europe, we heard that the worst performers were in Europe and not in Latin America, which is something new. And the question is, what is different this time? And that's what I'm going to talk about in the next 10-15 minutes. So here, what you have is the outcome of a statistical model where there is a statistical relationship, a co-integrating vector between world GDP, the terms of trade that for Latin America is commodity prices, international financial conditions, that is the return on bonds that are of similar risk to the bonds issued by Latin American countries. And what you see here is that Latin America has always been very sensitive to external shocks. You can interpret these things as statistical correlations between external shocks and economic performance in Latin America. And you see that Latin American, this is for the average Latin American country, and we can do exercises like this for each country, and we will see that Latin American countries are very dependent on external conditions. So, what is the unfolding of the typical crisis in Latin America? Here I'm just going to repeat what Guillermo Calvo has taught me for years. Maybe he should come and give this slide. But what is a typical crisis in Latin America? There is an external shock. It might be in terms of trade. It might be a financial shock like the Russian default in '98. And when this happens, countries have a current account deficit, usually also a fiscal deficit, and private balance sheets with a currency mismatch with that Guillermo Calvo calls liability dollarization, in which households, firms, banks have dollar-denominated debts and assets or sales or income that are in pesos to give or local currency. So then what happens? When the crisis hits, you need an adjustment in the real exchange rate. The price of non-tradables has to fall, and that creates a financial mess. And you also have that both the private sector and the government have to contract a lot because they cannot borrow anymore if credit to the country stops. So here you have 82. Here you have you see, all the time you see here, the fiscal balance and the current account balance, it's negative. And when you have the crisis, you have to adjust the current account and adjust the budget. Now, and here we have the response to the Russian crisis. This is, and what happens to monetary and fiscal policy? Because of the currency mismatch and the tension that is between letting the exchange rate depreciate when you need it and the balance sheet problem, the exchange rate almost doesn't move. Here, this is 6%, which is kind of a very small change. The interest rate goes up, and there is a fiscal contraction. That's because countries were borrowing, and now no credit comes to these countries, right? What I want to show you is that the response to this crisis is very different from previous ones. And by the way, the credit for these slides goes, and for the previous one on external shocks goes to Alejandro Izquierdo and Ernesto Talvi. So, what was different this time? Stronger financial initial conditions. Latin American countries, by and large, were having current account surpluses, fiscal surpluses, a high level of reserves. There was also a better exchange risk management in both the private and the private sector. Countries in Latin America made a big effort in the last 10 years to have a local currency denominated debt for the public sector. Banking regulation also made banks be much more careful with the management of currency risk, lending in dollars only to exporters. And as a result of that, there is no Latin American countries can have a lot more exchange rate flexibility because now exchange rate movements do not create a financial mess. And something that was different this time too was that early on, the Federal Reserve and the G20 and the IMF put resources available as lenders of last resort. So that didn't have a strong impact in the Latin American economies per se, but the financial shock was smaller, and actually there is some work by Izquierdo and Talvi as well that shows that the increase in the spreads for Latin America were much lower than in previous crises, and part of that is because Latin American countries were not having liquidity problems because there were credit lines and initial conditions that facilitated that. So here you have numbers for many countries. Here is the average for South America and Mexico. You see a positive fiscal balance, positive current account balance, and I claim that that was very important. So now you see that at the time of the crisis, how did monetary and fiscal policy react? Now, because of the fact that there were no balance sheet effects of exchange rate fluctuations, in many countries, when the crisis hit, the exchange rate depreciated, and that made much easier the adjustment of the relative price of non-tradables